article is Research Opportunities in Internal Control Quality and Quality Assurance. And basically the presentation is going to follow the similar outline to the article itself. We'll discuss what is internal control, the distinguishing factors of the definitions of internal control that are discussed in the article, user demands for internal control quality assurance, barriers to internal control quality reporting. The author discusses 2, practice barriers and research barriers. Then we'll discuss trends in internal control, and then we will conclude. So there was a quote in the article that I really think kind of drives home the point of the importance of internal control. And the author says, "I now believe that knowledge about internal control is an essential element that affects the welfare of management, corporate directors, shareholders, training partners of an entity, auditors, and society at large." So I guess, who can describe internal control? What does it mean? When you guys hear the term, what do you think of?
It's a procedure to reduce the risk, and therefore it can reduce the expected loss for the company.
Okay. Anyone else?
I would like to put it in an example, like when I was having an internship in a bank. If I want to open a drawer, there must be another person next to me. That is kind of internal control.
Exactly. Exactly. Now, as someone on the other side in the company, why is that important? What do you guys think? What's the significance behind that? Well, it's basically, as someone, let's say Andrea is the CEO of a company and she's in charge of making decisions. Now, her biggest concern is, well, is the information that my employees are providing me with, is that correct? Is it proper information for me to make a valid business decision? So that's really, and even as a user from the other side, not an internal perspective, as someone who's an investor or creditor, we want to know that the company is organized, that they're, on top of their processes, they understand their responsibilities, and things are intact. So basically, the author provides 2 definitions. According to COSO, internal control is a process effected by an entity's board of directors, management, and other personnel designed to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of objectives in effectiveness and efficiency of operations, reliability of financial information, and compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So now this definition implicitly assumes a constant external environment, whereas the next definition we're going to discuss assumes an external environment that's constantly changing, which is more realistic, because in the real world, you're not always going to have, like, let's say, your example that you provided, sometimes in the control, in the process, it'll give a specific level of a senior person that's supposed to be with you when you open up that drawer. Let's say that person is out, and you have someone else that's either at level equal or above. Sometimes you have exceptions like that, so that's more realistic. So the Canadian COCO expands upon the definition by adding that there is a risk of failure to maintain the organization's capacity to identify and exploit opportunities, and resilience or capacity to respond or adapt to unexpected risks and opportunities. So now, after seeing the 2 definitions, you see that there's a couple of differences between the 2. They kind of incorporate a lot of, components. So then the author then goes on to identify the distinguishing factors, and there are 3. The first is that the definitions are very broad in nature, and they're definitely more broad than traditional definitions of internal accounting controls. So when we review the 2 definitions provided, we see terms and phrases such as efficiency and effectiveness of operations, compliance with laws and regulations, and responsiveness to external changes. Their inclusion allows us to infer that both definitions are applicable to all of management functions, with the exception of choosing objectives and formulating strategies to achieve those objectives, and following up to unexpected results or control deviations or exceptions. The second factor is that they relate to processes. So basically that just means that, it's a changing external environment rather than a constant static state. Meaning that there are multiple steps and factors and possible exceptions due to the changing environment, like I just mentioned with the example that she provided, which makes it a little bit difficult to directly observe or identify a internal control process. You kind of have to, you usually, in auditing, you'll do a walkthrough and things like that, just to kind of get a handle of how they do it. But sometimes there are some processes that it's just really impossible to kind of follow it through from start to finish. The third factor is that they relate to risk, which means that it relates to the potential threat to an organization's ability to achieve their set goals. So that's that. Figure 1 of the article really kind of illustrates how over-encompassing and important the internal controls are in everyday business, as well as, to them achieving their long-term goals. It illustrates how an effective internal control environment and process is an essential component for managing information needed to justify and support decision-making processes. After discussing the definitions of internal control, what they are, how they affect an organization, the article then goes into who would benefit or need internal control quality assurance, which is a pretty valid question and a valid point when you stop to think of how time-consuming internal controls are, the development, the review, the execution, and things like that. So that leads us to user demand for internal control quality and assurance. So the processes allow users to determine risks of asset misappropriation, poor strategizing and decision-making as a result of poor information, and inefficiency or ineffectiveness of business processes. So there are a number of users that benefit and who create a demand for quality internal control assurance. Management, as I had said earlier with the example using Andrea, management relies on internal controls to have faith in the information that they're using to make their decisions. They also, use that to, document and illustrate that they are fulfilling their responsibilities of overseeing and, fulfilling their fiduciary and legal responsibilities. Another group of users are audit committees and outside directors, and similar to management, they do have that big brother kind of point of view where they need to be monitoring to make sure that the company's, doing what they're supposed to, following the procedures and policies set forth. So internal control does help them do that. When I was working in public, when we were doing our SOX 404 testing for a big public client, we used to spend months for our 404 testing, and it was this big report that the manager and the partner would, go and discuss with the audit committee and stuff like that. So, it's another check for the audit committee and the directors to kind of show, well, they conducted this, we reviewed it, we are fulfilling our oversight responsibilities. Supplier, customers, and workers, basically they just want assurance because it does affect their welfare in dealing with the organization. And the last group is investors, regulators, and creditors. It's a means of reducing information surprises for them and misappropriations of assets and things like that. So even though all of these parties have a mutual necessity and a desire for assurance, they all differ in their demand because each of them have different abilities into how they can react and rectify any deviations in internal controls. So that's kind of where the author goes when he discusses barriers to internal quality control. So the first barrier is practice barriers, and it includes the absence of adequate criteria, adequate methods, and reporting regime. So now the problem with criteria is that it's difficult for a third party to measure and evaluate internal control quality on a consistent basis when there's so many different ways to achieve a certain goal. It's very different from one company to the next in the way they operate and their staff and things like that. It's very hard to have, a transparency that can carry over from one client to the next. So the next problem with auditing a process, auditing an internal control process over a period of time is much more difficult than a point in time. Typically, most financial statement auditors are unfamiliar with auditing continuous processes, and there's also a lot of debate on what type of documentation is appropriate when auditing internal control processes. That was a big thing that when I was still at Ernst & Young, they had just gone through, as the company as a whole, they had just gone through their review, and it, the biggest comment was documentation. Whereas we thought, we over-documented and we covered our bases and we, included everything that we did in our control testing. They had said it's really not good enough. So while it was disheartening, it's just very hard. It's a lot of perspective, and it's hard to kind of just determine what is sufficient. With the reporting regime, the author had said it hasn't been developed for a variety of reasons, mainly due to the fact that it is difficult communicating detailed internal control quality to third parties because their ability to act upon them differs. As an investor, if you're an investor in Pepsi and you find out there's a control deficiency, it's not like you can walk up to management and say, what did you do? And give them that parenting finger that you always get when you did something wrong and say, hey, that's a big no-no. They're not really gonna take you seriously, so it's kind of hard for them. The most you can do is either buy, sell, or give up that security. Plus also, thinking about it, if you do report that, and if it is common knowledge, it may give you a loss of a competitive edge. In the article, the author does provide a potential solution to it, which, as we've seen in previous papers that we've read in other classes, it is put into practice today. You limit the distribution of comprehensive reports to the entity management, audit committees, and other directors who do have direct ability to, act to correct, any deficiencies and things like that, and who actually can make a difference and prevent any potential issues in the future. And then you give more limited reports to employees, suppliers, and customers, as well as creditors. And this also does limit auditor liability because it's not distributed to the general public, so it's not like us as investors are using it to make investment decisions. The next type of barriers the author discusses are research barriers, which I feel like are still even applicable even today. There is limited knowledge. As scholars, there is a limitation to their knowledge and experience of business strategy, organization design, processes, risk measurement. There's also a lack of knowledge regarding internal control alternatives and process verification. Next is the inherent complexity of the internal control process. So as we previously discussed, as a result of the inherent complexity and the nature of internal controls themselves, it is difficult to measure internal control processes in a quality experiment. The third, and I think a big barrier that sometimes is kind of still in existence today, is lack of access to data, organizations, and management. I did a paper on Sarbanes-Oxley a few years ago, and we tried doing a survey and getting people from certain companies that we had sent the surveys to send them back was like pulling teeth. And then when I had to call them to follow up, it was awful and embarrassing. I felt like I was this telemarketer that was bothering them, and they just, they really didn't understand the importance of it. So that's a huge, barrier. The fourth would be generalizability of research results. Researchers face this potential prejudice of being a case study rather than a large sample study of generalizable behavior. And then there's a limited range of publication outlets, because there is limited reader interest in internal control topics versus, readers being interested in internal control quality and quality assurance, which affects management profitability. That's more where we see it going. Today, now getting back to the lack of access to data, nowadays there are researchers that can use organizations such as the IMA, Financial Executives Institute, and Institute of Internal Auditing, and even Protiviti as well. They do a lot of research regarding internal controls and things like that. And those organizations will help you get access to their members and, you know, interview them, do surveys and things like that. So that's something that has changed today.
Can I just say something? First, Bill Kinney, the author of this article, is probably the preeminent audit researcher in the world. Okay, this paper was published in 2000, and so that's prior to Sarbanes-Oxley, and prior to the major push in the need for opinion on internal controls. So you have to understand the context. I thought he's quite prescient here in advance, thinks of some of the problems that there is. He's not a computer guy, he's mainly a statistician. He did a lot of things with things like sampling and etc. And he's very interested. For example, he always interested on the idea of continuous auditing and involved. And this paper needs to be updated into a paper of 2020 or 2015 on exactly the same issues, but now the year 2000 was the year that many companies started and adopted ERPs, enterprise like SAP and etc. And why was that? Because they used the excuse of the year 2000, but for realizing that they needed to update the IT systems. And you know, people don't realize, but IT systems are like a wall or like a house. You need to update the roof, you're constantly working on it to make them better. And so what they did is at that time, they transformed a lot of corporate information systems into ERPs, but there were pieces of it that were just too big and too complex to adopt an ERP. So they created these legacy systems that are still around, in huge legacy systems that are being maintained separately. But you need to update this particular paper with modern information technology. ERPs in the cloud, big data, Internet of Things, this kind of thing need to be put in here. So this is a challenge for any one of you to write a paper updating Bill Kinney. Courageous thing updating Bill Kinney, but go ahead. Felisha.
And then the author identifies 3 trends that affect the future of internal control quality, which it's pretty cool to see, because for each of the trends that he identifies, we see today that all the trends that he predicted have come to fruition. The first is information technology, the automation of processes that is very prevalent in organizations today. They were all about, especially with, you know, after Sarbanes-Oxley and you know, the costs that companies incurred having to, you know, meet the requirements of 404. Whenever they were able to automate a process, they did. Globalization implies outsourcing non-core processes. Then lastly is regulation. So this means that, you know, the impact of regulation on internal control should be considered but not depended upon for analysis in regards to researchers. It focuses management's attention, the requirement to demonstrate compliance. So, which brings us to the conclusion. Overall, I think this article was definitely, you know, very useful in illustrating the importance of internal control on a regular basis, and I think it you know, identifies so many venues and paths for you to take in terms of researching it, because it is such a vast topic. There's so many aspects and angles you can go, you know, you could take to research. So that's really it. Does anyone have any questions? Really good?
Yeah, I like a lot his research where he is in page 88 here. And I think they're interesting to have a look at it. And you know, I was just coincidentally this morning, I was talking with Abdullah Aman, because I think he's going to do a dissertation on this area. And he was complaining to me, saying that I don't know what to do, and etc. And I say, that's what research is. You don't know what to do. And we're trying to figure out what to do. He was hoping to be more structure for it. But when it's so vague and you don't have a lot to anchor on, it's more interesting. More difficult, but much more interesting. And the literature haven't really dealt with internal controls in large ERP and legacy systems together. So there's a lot to be taken. The other thing for you to just kind of put this into context, her example was about opening a cash machine and being 2 people there. Or the example I always use is you're not supposed to originate the transaction and at the same time approve it, etc. So these are very pedestrian type of examples from the days of manual systems. But remember, systems might go very automated, but many of them still have a good manual portion to it. But now, today, you go to one ERP, SAP or Oracle, etc. They will have 10,000 internal controls built into it. And they are configurable controls. What does that mean? A user can able and enable or change the parameters of some of these controls. So the paper that we wrote with Brennan and etc. was basically trying to deal with this issue of configurable controls. And what we need to do is actually bring together a theory and a way of thinking about large number of controls, many of them automated, some of them configurable, and then the manual controls that precede these automated controls. And there's a lot of research needs here.
Yeah, I have a question about the definition of internal control, whether 1992 version or 2013 version. They didn't touch corporate governance because internal control is a broad concept and it can touch cover any area in the firm, in the company, but they never say anything about corporate governance. Is some reason or?
The form of governance is a form of control, but in general, in audit plans, you don't do a lot of kind of governance audits. Is that correct? So it's kind of above it. And typically the auditors hedge it by saying that they examine the auditee very carefully at the beginning to see if there is no symptom that is corrupt management. Because in general, they say it's not auditable if management is corrupt, is really corrupt. Did you agree with that? Don't say yes if you don't.
In terms of the not auditing the corporate governance.
Yeah, well, that's how you do your client investigation before you hire a client, is because if the client is crooked to begin with, very difficult to audit and find anything. Okay, so that's what they do in investigation. Now, maybe with automated systems and automated tests, maybe you can find if the client is crooked, but if they modify the ERP, it is very difficult.
But
Very difficult.
speaking of corporate governance, I know there are some audit procedures that are done.
Yeah, you do a little bit.
Yeah, like over the board minutes and things like that. I know we used to examine those. So they are looking to see that the functioning is at least there. But I think the focus is really the financial statements and what gets into there. But they do look at some of the, I guess you could call them controls over if the board is, the board minutes and what's being discussed at the meetings. I know we used to look at those, so.
I wonder if you could write and text miner automated that would look at board minutes and maybe use methodology of the first study and develop rules and algorithms to detect governance failures or something like that, and create a large taxonomy of governance examination, let's say, algorithms to do it. I wonder if that could be. But the higher you go in the conceptualization of the firm, it's more difficult to automate it. It's easier to automate. I look at the organization chart. If you are above her, so then you had a superior approve this or not. That you can do. Just use payroll, just use your human resources thing, and then you look what was done. But when you talk about kind of vague concepts of governance, independence, etc., it's difficult. That's why I don't do a lot of research on that.
I have a question for you. So you mentioned the regulators, you did this Section 4.4 audits, SOX audits, and you mentioned the regulators come back to you and say, well, this is not enough. Do you recall if they needed more documentation and clarification for manual controls or IT-related controls?
It was both. It was documentation as a whole. They wanted better documentation of the flow charts. They wanted specifically literally the who, what, where, and when, and what you saw, confirm that you saw a signature, confirm that you did speak to this person. If there was an exception, define it. It was just better wording, I guess, be more detailed.
I mean, because I remember we had to do the same. PCAOB came back to us and said, well, you're not documenting enough. You can't support your opinion with what you currently have, the evidence that you have. And what, I'm not going to get into specifics, but a lot of what we did, it was just restating a lot of what we already had done. So it wasn't necessarily, kind of improving, in my opinion. It was sort of the same thing, just more of the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, when I looked at some of the controls that they had updated, to address the comments and the new firm policies on how to document these firm controls, I didn't really find any value added. It really was just, it was almost like you said, they were repeating and just doing the same thing that they had done, just adding one or two more sentences of steps that really weren't necessary per se.
So one comment I had about the paper, I think there's a very important distinction with regard to internal control quality that I don't believe the author addresses, and that is very similar to what the professor was saying earlier today with the validation and the verification. When you have an internal control, the internal control is trying to accomplish something. There's something you're trying to prevent, be it fraud or some other mistakes or anything like that. Then there's the implementation of the internal control. And there's two separate parts to the quality that you can measure. You can measure, is this internal control actually, is it actually accomplishing, assuming it's carried out correctly, is it accomplishing its goal of preventing the fraud or the error? That's one aspect of the quality. The second aspect is it actually being carried out properly? So just to take the example of, let's say that the person who originates the transaction can't sign off on it. So one thing you could look at is, well, do you have any cases where someone is originating and signing off on the same transaction? And then the other thing is, well, is it preventing the fraud that it's supposed to be preventing? Do you have cases of fraud, even though you're having separate people originate the transaction and actually sign off on it? I thought that was very important, but I don't think that the author actually pointed out that there's two very different aspects of quality.
Yeah. And one thing I want to clarify, or at least make a point. What he mentioned is that controls to avoid fraud. But actually controls are not only to avoid fraud. There are many other reasons that make sure that the process is correctly made, and many controls are not really related to fraud, but they are related to do the things the way they need to be done, or they're going to come out wrong. So, and it's very easy to kind of fall in this thing of talking controls always directed to fraud. I would say in a classic paper, now I don't know how relevant it is from a couple of guys from Brigham Young that did a study for the IIA, and they kind of said that out of 100 anomalies, 95 are just errors, and 5% of them are fraudulent. And this very old paper, so we don't really know if that's true today, but that's what the literature said.
Well, it's kind of like exceptional exceptions. Which ones are just because you set the bar too high/low?
Yeah, you find a lot of things that are wrong in the process. Now, he said another thing that I wanted to point out, or maybe say the terminology a little bit different. The traditional thing of looking at a system of internal controls have two components. One component in manual systems or etc. One component seeing if the design of the control system satisfies the objectives. And then the second thing is the company obeying those controls? And when you run your tests on that, you do evaluation of the system of controls, and then obedience, compliance testing. And there is another form of testing they call dual testing, that you take advantage if you're already looking at the control, you look at the value of the transaction. Okay, so you're doing substantive test and the compliance test together. Okay, but that's kind of traditional way to look at it. Today, when you open a system of ERP for a bank, you're not going to see if the system design with 10,000 controls is adequate. You're going to basically see where the overrides of the controls, what was it changed upon, and et cetera, et cetera. So there is a different set of considerations, and that's why I say Bill Kinney's paper needs to be updated. But to get it in the Audit Journal or the Accounting Review, you have to be Bill Kinney. That's it?
That's it.
Okay.
I mean, I
Any
have a
comments,
presentation, but I'm not going to redo the same presentation.
So you guys like this paper?
Yeah.
Old paper, I always put it in because Bill is such a clean thinker, and when he explains things, he's so well explained that I think it's always, reading Bill Kinney's papers is always a pleasure. Yeah, very well. He writes like Ted Mock, very direct.
Well, I like how he writes because I think in one section in the beginning of the paper, he says, I was preparing for my MBA class and I started thinking like how I can teach the internal control to my MBAs.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, my advisor, Ted Mock, he's published nearly as much as Bill. He is really very good. And Ted writes really concisely. So one thing that I take a lot of beef from my students, from JATA, when I edited JATA, JIS, etc., is my opinion is. Why are you writing that? If you're putting in the paper, it's your opinion. You don't have to do, the seminal paper of Yehuda, put the whole title of the paper in there. You don't do that. You might do that for the New York Times, but don't do that in an academic paper. If you state something, it is your opinion. Okay? Don't put the name of the author in the middle of a sentence. If you want to quote someone, you put the traditional notation. Yehuda, I don't know if you forgot your last name, 2016, that's it. Okay? Avoid putting words that you don't need. Anytime you state something, is your opinion. If you are citing someone else, is their opinion. Things like, we believe that this is the first paper in the literature. If you believe it, say this is the first paper in the literature. Okay, but try to avoid idle words. All what it makes is a paper longer and look stupid. So don't do it. Don't you find it very annoying to get this paper full of, and the other thing is I always get paper with 70 we, 20 I, okay? I don't know how many hours. You really have to do the paper in the first tense, fine. But don't do it, don't say in same sentence 3 times me, okay? It's just bad writing. And following it doesn't really, is unpleasant. For the foreign students, try to avoid the same word twice in one sentence. Okay, particularly it's difficult because you're talking about the controls in the system in the control environment. So you have 3 controls there. It's difficult to get rid of them, but try to.